Watching MMA as a new fan is one of the greatest experiences ever. Everything is fresh and exciting, but as your fandom grows in time, you start to see the patterns. It's not that it's not exciting anymore, it's just that you've experienced it all a million times. But there's one thing that both new and old fans alike will react to the same, and that is when this sport produces those rare moments that are almost beyond belief. I'm not talking about the fight of the night, or big finishes, or even unexpected upsets. I'm talking about moments so exceedingly rare and unbelievable that they can define your fandom. They're the moments that you remember exactly where you were and who you were with when you saw or heard about them, and today I'm going to attempt to chronicle some of those points in time that absolutely destroyed our entire sense of what this sport is. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point. A massive thank you to our channel Hall of Famers for all of their support, and these are moments that completely broke fight fans' minds. When I pitched this idea to the team, I put it very simply. These were the moments where you uttered, "There's no fucking way." You were probably screaming it, but you understand the vibe, right? So those are the types of moments we're going to be looking at, and I think it would be fun to do these in chronological order, sort of a timeline of these moments in the fandom. And I think nothing says more about the impact of these types of moments than the fact that this sport was built upon one of the ultimate there's absolutely no way occurrences that's ever taken place, especially for the simple folk back in 1993, where we're going to start our journey. I'm of course talking about skinny little hoist Gracie and his gi beating all those other martial artists in the UFC 1 tournament with a martial art the vast majority of us had never even heard of. It went against all logic, even if that logic was basically produced from action movies. But the surprise of Gracie's victory set the tone for the sport going forward. Funny enough, the next real oh my god mind-breaker moment in the sport would also come from Hoist when he would fall to Kazushi Sakuraba in one of the most legendary bouts of all time. Saku had been burning through the Gracie clan in the lead up to that fight, but Hoist's reputation because of his unbelievable success in the early UFC and his unbeaten record put him on a pedestal above all other Gracies as the best representative of the family, with all respect to Hickson of course. It wasn't that he couldn't lose, it just seemed so incredibly unlikely given his previous status in the sport. Saku's win in their epic 90-minute showdown, which would see Hoist's family throw in the towel, a surreal sight, was a turning point in the sport. And propelled Pride FC even further ahead of all the other mixed martial arts promotions in the world. Speaking of finishes in Pride that we simply could not handle, I think the most brain-busting had to be when Kevin Randleman knocked out Cro Cop in 2004. At the time, Cro Cop was the most feared striker in the entire sport, with every Pride victory coming via knockout. And if there was anybody who was going to return the favor, it wasn't going to be a wrestler with really a single KO on his record. Every one of us was proven wrong in under 2 minutes, because that is exactly what happened. It was beyond words. Just ask Mauro Ranallo. Despite Pride's massive popularity and its hold on the sport, by early 2007, the UFC would rise up as a legitimate competitor in the early 2000s thanks to The Ultimate Fighter.
Do you want to be a fighter? Do you want to be a fighter?
Even with that massive boom though, fans were in shock when seemingly out of nowhere, Pride was dead and the UFC had purchased them. The fall would not come as a result of any kind of drop-off, but from news magazines in Japan exposing Pride FC's deep ties to the Yakuza. So as a fan, unless you were hardcore enough to be on forums or reading what was going on in Japan at the time, this all came as a sudden shock. One day Pride was there, the next they were not, and now all of their best talent was exclusively in the UFC. A byproduct of that purchase would come just a month after the acquisition in one of the most what are the chances knockouts this sport has ever produced.
Wow! That is the last thing anybody expected here tonight.
Or Cro Cop would be on the wrong end of another stunner, this time far worse, when he was KO'd by Gabriel Gonzaga with a massive head kick. The thing that Cro Cop was more known for than anybody else in the sport. It was like a teenager pulling out their own machete and chopping Jason Voorhees down before he could get the chance. That's not how this is supposed to happen. Mirko's demise a month after Pride's was incredibly symbolic. As crazy as 2007 was as a result of Pride's fall, it would also see one of the unlikeliest of UFC champions crowned. Randy Couture's last significant victory had come 3 years prior when he regained the light heavyweight title from Vitor Belfort. In the time since, he'd finished out his trilogy with Chuck Liddell by losing twice and then retired. Not exactly a man you'd expect to be champion, especially at 43 years old, and back at heavyweight where he hadn't fought in half a decade. After an entire year's layoff no less, Couture beat the brakes off Tim Sylvia for 25 minutes to become the oldest champion in UFC history, a record I'm not sure it's ever going to be possible for someone to break. Weak division or not, that is just ridiculous.
Not bad for an old man.
Couture's revival had fans clamoring for a dream matchup with heavyweight king Fedor Emelianenko. During his contract dispute with the promotion, there was hope that it might come together through Mark Cuban no less, but the matchup never materialized. No doubt a mind-breaking moment that would have been though. Unbeaten for a decade and truly unbeaten entirely, Fedor had reached mythical status in the sport by 2010. It wasn't that he was invulnerable. It was clear that he could be hurt and had been on several occasions. It just felt like that no matter what happened, he would Terminator his way through it and find a way to win, just like he had for 10 plus years. With the death of Pride, Fedor bounced around for a few years before landing with the UFC's realest competition since claiming the sport's top spot in Strikeforce. The promotion had a major deal with CBS, and Fedor's previous bout against Brett Rogers was shown in prime time on network television to a viewership of 5.4 million people, the type of deal the UFC could only dream of at the time. But it was his next fight, one that wasn't expected to be as significant, relegated to Showtime, that would end up being one of the all-time mind-breaking moments this sport has ever produced. Caught in a triangle armbar after an early flurry that saw Fabricio Verdum go to the ground, Fedor would be forced to tap. Just once, mind you, because it's Fedor.
Fedor losing for the first time. Fabricio Verdum.
The greatest fighter that had ever lived had been defeated almost instantly, and by someone that most fans only vaguely remembered as a guy who fought a few times in the UFC. It's hard to describe how unbelievable this moment was without the context of being a fan during that time period, but it very much felt like, and maybe this is in poor taste, when news breaks of a celebrity passing but way too young. That's the closest equivalent that I can think of in terms of the shock factor and simply not being able to process the news. While Strikeforce was rolling along and gaining momentum as a result of moments like Fedor's first loss, and his second, and his third. You know what? I don't really want to talk about that anymore. Anyway, a rising star out of the WEC, which was a Zuffa-owned promotion, would pretty much break the sport with a single kick that same year Fedor first fell. Anthony Pettis, in the final bout in WEC history, before the promotion was to be absorbed by the UFC, landed the Showtime kick, a highlight so legendary it's still shown to this day when people put together compilations.
Brings down the curtain.
Oh my goodness! He ran off the wall like a ninja.
I mean, kicking off the cage like that, it's straight up out of a martial arts film. Would never expect to see that in a real fight. It's never been replicated, never been topped. It's still the greatest kick that's ever landed. And no matter how many times I see it, it still defies all logic. It just breaks my brain.
And it's just one of the things I hope is in highlight videos forever.
The WEC merger would only strengthen the UFC's hold on the sport and add several new divisions to the promotion. But in early 2011, Strikeforce was still very much a legitimate number 2 brand and a threat to the UFC. And then seemingly overnight, just like Pride, that changed entirely. Looking for new strategic investors, with several big money offers on the table, Zuffa blew the market up and paid way overpriced for Strikeforce to force a sale. And just like that, the UFC's biggest competition was now under their banner. Don't get me wrong, I was a massive fan of the UFC at the time, and I was psyched that all these fighters were going to be coming over to the UFC eventually. But this really did feel like a killing blow to the sport. Everybody knows competition is good for business, and after this shocking sale, the UFC was now the only possible source for top-tier MMA in the entire market, a reality that has not changed since that day. Only 5 months later, the UFC's complete victory over the sport would bring us another all-time hell froze over moment, a partnership with Fox Sports.
To kick things off, I'd like to introduce the distinguished executives.
The UFC was done with Spike TV. They were now going to be on network television, beamed into millions of homes with no cable subscription required. Mixed martial arts felt more mainstream than ever, and in many ways it was, with the exception of one key aspect, of course.
When are we gonna see women in the UFC, man?
Never.
Never?
Enter Ronda Rousey, a Strikeforce standout with the most star power we'd seen from a female fighter since Gina Carano. Just a month after that statement, she'd changed Dana's mind completely, and in late 2012, she was signed to a UFC contract. Ronda was going to usher in an entire division. It was a moment that nobody ever thought they would see, but one that made so much sense at the time with Rousey's momentum. The hardcore fan base was on board, and the mainstream would follow. White had struck gold at the perfect time, and Ronda's star would usher in an acceptance of MMA that had never been seen before. So much of her run had those surreal, is this even reality moments. Her calling out Floyd Mayweather at the ESPYs.
I wonder how Floyd feels being beat by a woman for once.
All her finishes that were short enough for Vine. Remember Vine, kids? The president of the United States tweeting his disdain for her. Ronda's whole run is really one of those mind-breaking moments in and of itself.
It's an honor to call your fights.
You're the best ever. You're just a true once-in-a-lifetime human being.
Rousey helped usher in a golden age in the sport alongside Conor McGregor, who would take the sport to new heights and levels of mainstream acceptance that nobody could have possibly dreamed. This growth would lead to the UFC's sale to WME IMG and the most mind-blowing return to the sport that's ever happened. At UFC 199, right before the flagship 200 event, right before the UFC would announce their sale at $4.2 billion to Endeavor, a promo would be shown for 200, one that featured Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier heavily. But then, at the end, like a fucking post-credit scene in a Marvel movie, Brock Lesnar appears.
Can you see me now? Can you see me now?
Oh my god, what in the hell? It was insane. Everybody lost their minds. Of course, if you were a hardcore fan who followed MMA online, you found out earlier from Ariel Helwani, not that that didn't make it as equally mind-blowing, it was still insane no matter how you heard it, because after 5 years away, after diverticulitis, still being under contract with the WWE, Brock Lesnar was returning to the cage. Who was his opponent? How was he going to be handling USADA? A million questions raced through the mind, but to have the biggest star of the previous era back for the UFC's biggest ever show, man, that was a mind-blowing reveal. The results of the whole thing wouldn't turn out so great. A few years later in 2018, the UFC's landmark deal with Fox was ending, and everybody was wondering where they would end up. The word was that Fox didn't intend to offer more cash to renew, and so despite the massive momentum of everything that led up to 200 a few years earlier, it felt as if maybe the product was starting to stale. Conor was in absentia, Ronda had retired, but through a series of happenstances that are almost as unbelievable as the news itself, the UFC, who had a long and combative history with the worldwide leader in sports, was headed to ESPN. If you'd have told any MMA fan before Lesnar debuted that the UFC was going to be on ESPN someday, it would have been like telling them that the biggest star in the promotion someday was going to be a woman. Just absurd to the point of laughable. And yet both things fucking happened. The earliest oh my god what just happened highlight of the ESPN era of the UFC was a knockout that still seems so improbable in hindsight. I'm not entirely sure it doesn't confirm that we're in fact in a simulation. Yair Rodriguez and Korean Zombie had just put on a banger that was heading to the cards, but at the horn, Yair would somehow land an elbow that I'm still unsure about the mechanics of to put KZ out cold. The initial confusion as to what happened was like somebody had just disappeared into thin air. Paul Felder on commentary believed it was an accidental headbutt, and then the replay happened and the sport collectively lost its mind.
It was an elbow. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Joe Rogan was missing from the commentary team in that moment because by 2018, he was no longer doing Fight Night cards, probably because he was too busy being one of the most important people on the planet. In 2020, Joe made a deal with Spotify for $200 million for the podcast he started in his living room with his buddy on a MacBook. I don't care what anybody says, there's not a soul on this planet who ever thought, even in their wildest dreams, that Joe Rogan, comedian, Fear Factor host, and UFC commentator, would become the most influential podcast host on the entire planet.
Hi, meow meow.
Hi, Ruff Ruff.
Lives have been made and broken as a result of a single appearance on his show. And while these facts are not directly related to mixed martial arts, it is so mind-blowing that it deserves mention in this video. We're now at the point in this timeline where, for me personally, something happened that I could not process at all. It stuck with me for days. I would be laying in bed and it would come up again in my mind and I would just say, what are the fucking chances? I'm talking about Chris Weidman's leg break. If you don't know, then you're probably new here, but very famously, Anderson Silva broke his leg horrifically on a checked kick against Weidman in their rematch for the middleweight title. Side note, Chris's knockout of Anderson in their first fight probably qualifies as one of those mind-breaking moments as well. The break was one of the most infamous and freakish injuries that's ever taken place in the sport. Yes, it has happened a few other times in smaller promotions, and of course famously now as well to Conor McGregor, but it is exceedingly rare, to the point where it's not exactly something you ever expect to see, and you are never ready when it happens. But to happen to Chris Weidman, after being on the other end of that equation with Anderson Silva, the most infamous example of such a leg break, it honestly sounds like a nightmare that Chris would have at some point in his life, that the roles were reversed, and he woke up in a cold sweat saying, thank God that wasn't real. The level of shock and horror will never be topped for me. I cannot handle it.
I know there's a lot of people out there that are going through tough times, and there's not really any need of or reason to be positive, but I'm telling you right now, they're over this. Great things could come from terrible situations.
And while that was one of those things that seemed unbelievable in chance to occur, it probably paled in comparison to finding out that the UFC and WWE were going to be merging. The only thing I could compare that to is if on the news tomorrow we found out that Subway bought McDonald's. Sure, the UFC and the WWE weren't directly competing in the exact same markets, but they were so closely adjacent to each other otherwise that the two companies often found themselves in conflict. Jason did an excellent video about this rivalry. In fact, you should go watch it. So to see them come together, and seemingly out of nowhere too, was just mind-blowing. That picture of Vince and Triple H and Dana at the New York Stock Exchange, what alternate reality am I living in? And there wasn't some huge build-up to this news. It felt like one day we all woke up and somebody was telling us that the UFC and the WWE were now the same company. It wasn't even a scenario that I thought, oh, this couldn't happen. It hadn't even crossed my mind. Still can't believe it.
This is going to be UFC 2.0.
Was that the craziest thing to happen in 2023 in combat sports, though? Yeah, probably, but if there's anything that could compete with it, it's Francis Ngannou knocking down Tyson Fury in a boxing match.
Have you got a big Tory?
When Ngannou left the UFC, there was a ton of blowback, and many assuming that he'd just thrown his entire career away, that he was going to have to settle for whatever the PFL could pay him, but that pie-in-the-sky idea of making a turn in the world of boxing was never going to materialize. So in some ways, the fact that the fight with Fury, the arguable greatest heavyweight boxer in the world at the time and one of the greats of his generation, even happened at all, was something probably worthy of this video. But to knock the man down, nobody expected that. Who knows, maybe not even Ngannou himself.
I won this from the moment that they accepted the fight. I was very underestimated. If they have known that beforehand, maybe this fight would have never happened.
Everybody was just so happy he was getting the opportunity. But we'd all heard this song before. Plenty of MMA fighters had made their way to boxing, and the results were not good. And this was a fight at the highest level. No, this was not going to end well. It was fun that it happened, and that is it. I remember distinctly, I was watching the fight on my phone. I was with my family. They weren't going to be interested in the bout, so I sat there and quietly observed until Ngannou got that knockdown, at which point I was desperately trying to explain to my family that the craziest thing that's ever happened just took place. They probably weren't understanding given the yelling and how much that had just broken my brain. Nobody is going to remember Ngannou's losses in boxing, but the one part of his legacy in that sport that is forever is that knockdown, which takes us to our final moment in the timeline, one that was given to us just this year. If you're anything like me, a guy who has been watching this sport for over 2 decades, you've pretty much seen everything there is to see. And while there are finishes that are still amazing to me, when you see enough of them, it starts to lose a little bit of that wow factor. It takes something really special to get old heads to lose their minds. Max Holloway had even the most jaded of fans with their jaws on the floor. If you had lost that spark for MMA over the years, this was the moment that put that twinkle back in your eye. I have no doubt in 5 years, we'll be hearing from a bunch of fans who said they started watching because of Holloway's knockout on Gaethje. We've all watched it 300 times by now. Last second, last shot, out cold. Very similar on paper to what happened between Yair and Zombie in 2018. The difference being, well, quite a few things. The biggest of which is meeting in the middle and agreeing to throw until somebody dies. It was like something out of a movie. Then there's the momentous nature of the occasion. This was UFC 300. This was for the BMF title, a belt that of course had no real meaning, but was given weight by those two guys being involved. All of that together and being a last second KO of that level, it's maybe the greatest highlight in the history of the sport, and one that the entire world collectively screamed out there's no fucking way wherever they were when they saw it happen. We just went through 20 or so moments today in a sport that's been prominent for more than 30 years now. That is how rare these types of moments are, and it's why they can absolutely define your fandom. They're a huge part of what makes watching MMA so damn compelling. I cannot imagine how many of these moments the next 30 years will bring us as fans, but I cannot wait. You know who blows my mind every single time they make one of my videos? The editor of this one, Luke Taylor. Please follow him on all his socials and go check out his awesome YouTube channel. A massive shout to our channel Hall of Famers. You guys are the best. We couldn't do these types of videos without you. Thank you so much, fight fans. If you would like to become a channel member, hit the join button. There's cool exclusive content, and you might have some say in our videos. Like and subscribe for more awesome trips down MMA memory lane. Comment down below the interesting experiences you guys had while witnessing these moments today, and thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic one.